this video, I want to look at the history of federal law as it affects public education in the United States. First, as a broad background, let's look at the 14th Amendment. This amendment to the Constitution was adopted in 1868 after the Civil War and granted citizenship and supposedly gave equal rights to African Americans in the United States. Section 1 of the 14th Amendment reads, "All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States. Nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws." Despite the quite clear wording of this amendment, which guarantees equal privileges and equal protection under the law, states continued to pass and enforce discriminatory legislation. Many of these laws would be challenged and eventually brought to the Supreme Court over the years. Often in the United States, Supreme Court rulings have just as much, if not more, importance than the original laws themselves. The next two items I will look at are both Supreme Court rulings that had important implications for education. Plessy v. Ferguson was a landmark Supreme Court case of 1896. While this case was specifically about a Louisiana state law forcing train companies to segregate trains, with black passengers required to travel in separate train cars than white passengers, its ramifications were widespread. This law was upheld by the Louisiana State Court and then finally went to the Supreme Court of the United States. There it was also upheld in a 7-1 majority decision. The one justice voting against the decision, Justice John Marshall Harlan, wrote a beautiful and eloquent dissent which I urge everyone to read. Despite the one dissent, the law was handily upheld, and this decision confirmed the separate but equal doctrine, which resulted in nearly 60 more years of racially segregated schools in the United States. Separate but equal ruled the day until the Brown v. Board of Education lawsuit, which was taken to the Supreme Court in 1954. This was a class action lawsuit brought against the Topeka, Kansas Board of Education. According to Wikipedia, the plaintiffs in Brown asserted that this system of racial separation, while masquerading as providing separate but equal treatment of both white and black Americans, instead perpetuated inferior accommodations, services, and treatment for black Americans. This decision declared state laws establishing separate public schools for black and white students to be unconstitutional. The decision overturned Plessy v. Ferguson and state-sponsored segregation of public education. Brown v. the Board of Education was a crucial win that helped to pave the way for the Civil Rights Movement and the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The Civil Rights Act of 1964. This legislation was the crowning glory of the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s. The law outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. While not primarily focused on education, but on employment and voting practices, the legislation did have an effect on public education due to its Title VI. Title VI states, "No person in the United States shall, on the ground of race, color, or national origin, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance." It should be noted that every step of the way, this legislation was fought in certain parts of the country, particularly in the Deep South. A prime example, quoted from civilrights.org, is the case of Arkansas Governor Orville Faubus, who ordered that the State National Guard unit block the admission of 9 African American students to Little Rock's Central High School in 1957. The nearly month-long confrontation ended when President Eisenhower sent in U.S. troops to protect the students. Another example is that of Prince Edward County, Virginia, which abandoned its entire public school system, leaving education to private interests that excluded African American children from their schools. Still quoting from civilrights.org, a strong federal commitment to enforcement of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 proved critical. In the first 5 years of the Act's passage, with the federal government threatening and sometimes using fund termination enforcement provisions, more substantial progress was made toward segregating schools than in the 10 years immediately following the Brown decision. In 1964, 1.2% of African American students in the South attended school with whites. By 1968, only 4 years later, the figures had risen to 32%.